Hi guys, I've been wanting to dive a little bit deeper into gut health. So I brought in my good friend, Dr. Pedi. Dr. Pedi is a naturopathic doctor and holistic nutritionist at the Pacific Pearl in La Jolla. He's super passionate about gut health, and I couldn't think of anybody better to explain the nuts and bolts to you guys. So Dr. Pedi, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me and thinking of me, Chelsea, Dr. Chelsea. I appreciate it. It's been a blessing being out there in the field and just practicing, working with patients and, implementing the beautiful things that we learn in our amazing field of naturopathic medicine.
Yeah, well, I got the privilege of seeing you work when we were in school, and I know you're amazing with patients.
Oh,
I also know that one of your one of the things that seems to guide your passion in gut health is this functional medicine perspective that you practice from. I know functional medicine is kind of a buzzword right now, and I don't know that everybody knows what it means. So before we kind of jump into the gut health, I was hoping you might be able to briefly explain what functional medicine is.
Sure thing. Functional medicine has a lot in common with naturopathic medicine in that it focuses on root cause. It's essentially root cause medicine. Um, it also takes into account lots of functional testing because in our field, we like to get objective data and metrics just so that we know what we're dealing with. Running basic tests like stool tests, micronutrient tests. It allows us to paint a complete picture of what's going on to be able to better address the underlying condition, dysfunction, whatever it may be. So looking at the root cause, doing proper testing that looks at functional parameters. In addition, it looks at the biology as a systems biology in that everything is connected. And that's one thing that's really special about functional medicine is it tries to bring everything together and paint a complete picture of what's going on specific to that patient.
So with functional medicine, we're looking at how the whole body is working together and how it's working
Absolutely.
not just on a sick or not sick level, but how optimally it's functioning.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the conventional world, oftentimes we look at pulmonology, cardiology, immunology in different silos, whereas it's all a complicated, intricate system. So functional medicine really tries to bring it all together and explain or address the situation as a whole, like you said.
Yeah, super amazing. So I know kind of at the core of some of that systems connectedness of functional medicine, we have gut health. So in your opinion, why do you think gut health is so important?
50, 60, 70, maybe greater than that years ago, the naturopathic doctors always said that all health begins in the gut. And now, as more research comes out on the microbiome, on the gut, we're really starting to see, or we're not starting to see, we're being more and more convinced that true health really does start in the gut. And when you think about it, we eat approximately 3 to 4 thousand pounds of food a year. That's a lot of
Crazy.
information that has to get processed through the gut. And when you look at food as more than energy and more than calories, as information, you really begin to see how what we put in our gut not only affects our digestive function, but it also affects our immune function, our brain health, our metabolism, our detox capacities, and so much more. So at the end of the day, optimizing gut function is on the priority list when it comes to functional medicine, naturopathic medicine, because it's just interconnected to everything else.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the most current research is showing us that the gut is connected to almost every system in the body, and it's
Absolutely.
intimately related to almost any health process that you could be having.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what kind of things make our gut unhealthy?
It's a great question. And a lot of things cause it to be unhealthy. First and foremost is food choices that we make. The food that we put in our body is constantly affecting our gut. Some foods could be pro-inflammatory, causing inflammation in the gut, whereas other foods could be anti-inflammatory, um, reducing inflammation in our gut. Some foods can be turning on the bad genes in our gut. Some foods could be turning off the bad genes in the gut, an area of study known as nutrigenomics. And additionally, we have the microbiome. So some foods could shift our microbiome or our bacterial balance in our gut towards a state of health, whereas other foods can shift our microbiome towards a state of imbalance, what is known as dysbiosis. So the food that we eat is constantly affecting our gut in one way or another, whether we know it or not.
I think that's such a huge point you bring up, because I think, you know, a lot of times we think this food is bad for me or it's good for me. And we think of it really in terms of, is it going to make me look good or not? But we forget that the food that we eat is actually turning on and off our immune system, which is incredible. But even more stunning than that, it's actually turning on and off our genes, leading to health or illness. And it's all going on in this area of the gut.
Of course.
So you kind of mentioned already that there is a connection between gut and the immune system. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Absolutely. Well, back to basic physiology, you know, our gut is like a tube that runs within us. And the walls of that tube are a layer of cells called enterocytes. And beyond this layer of cells is what we have that's called the GALT, or the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And that's just pretty much immune system that lines the entire walls of the gut. And when the gut wall or those enterocytes are compromised, what happens is that this immune system that lies inside of our gut is under constant attack. So at first, it starts trying to help us fight off things when all these things that are bad are coming through. But over time, it just becomes hyper vigilant, and it's just on high alert, and it's unable to distinguish friend from foe. And that's when it trips. And when it trips, the system breaks, and it could affect all parts of our body.
Yeah, I love what you said about it not being able to distinguish friend from foe. I remember in school, when we were in school together, we were learning how 70 to 90%, did I get that number right, of the immune system is located in the gut.
Absolutely. Thank you.
These parasites that you mentioned, protecting kind of your outside environment from the immune system in your gut, there's only one cell layer thick between immune exposure and outside exposure. And this big tube that you mentioned is one of our largest sources of exposure to the outside world. So from that perspective, it can be a lot easier than people realize for the immune system to get tripped.
Exactly. And what you said really shows how precious it is. It's just one cell thick. And we're like constantly exposing it to foods that, you know, are inflammatory, that can cause, I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard of the word leaky gut, which is what the word is floating around, but in scientific terms, it's intestinal permeability. So, you know, if there's constant exposure to inflammation through food, these cells are going to open up, and there's going to be gaps in between them, and foods, undigested food particles that aren't supposed to get through are going to get through and interact with the immune system and cause it to trip. And this is so important for us to be mindful of this. This is, you know, like what you said, most of our immune system is in our gut, which is really counterintuitive. And so we really have to be mindful of the things that we put in there if we want to optimize the function of our immune system.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you and I both know that once the immune system gets tripped, then that can affect pretty much anywhere else in the body, like you mentioned at the beginning. It can affect joints, it can affect, you know, things like headaches, muscle, exercise performance. But one area I think people are very interested in is the brain, mental health. So I see a lot of mental health patients, and we know that there's a connection between gut health and the brain. So can you kind of break that down for people and help us understand what's going on there?
Absolutely. I would love to. This is an area I'm very passionate about. Like you said, given my background in psychology, because I did a double major in psychology and lots of friends suffering from mental health. This is such an area I'm really passionate about. And I feel like with this surge in technology and social media, and it's not really helping mental health. So this is definitely an area I'm very passionate about. And like you said, yeah, the gut is the second brain. And to be honest, I like to challenge that sometimes and say that it's the first brain, because we actually have more bacteria DNA in our body and in our gut than we have human DNA. So to some degree, are we the main drivers of our physiology and our mental health, or are those bacteria the main drivers? So it's really interesting when you step back and look at the sheer volume of bacteria that we have inside us. And that's why they often refer to it as the gut, as the second brain, or this gut brain axis, which is the connection between the brain and the gut. And what's fascinating is that the research shows that there's actually more information on a day-to-day basis being sent from the gut up to the brain than from the brain down to the gut. So it is truly fascinating that, yes, the gut is the second brain. And what's even more intriguing is that majority of these neurotransmitters that we often see imbalances with in mental health, serotonin, dopamine, all of these things, a lot of them are actually made in the gut and not in the brain. So when you look at that, it really puts things into perspective that if there's someone coming in with mental health, we're oftentimes thinking brain up here, but the physiology and the research is showing it's down here.
Brain's in here.
So, exactly, kind of reinforcing how important it is for us to focus on gut health.
Yeah, I love what you said about the second brain, or maybe even the first brain being in the gut. So I think one of my kind of favorite facts about the gut is that it comes from the same embryonic tissue as your brain does. And a lot of people don't know your gut has its own nervous system.
That's right.
And it's interconnected with the nervous system and the rest of your body. And when our brain sends information to our gut, it's sending information about, digestion, gastric movement. But when the gut sends information to the brain, it's sending information about the neurotransmitter synthesis that you talked about inflammation. So when we have those microbes off balance in the gut, that's actually regulating our ability to produce neurotransmitters, not just in the gut, but also in the brain. So you got a double whammy there. And if you have inflammation in the gut from that damage, from those shifts, it's also creating inflammation in the brain. So I don't think you can really separate the two.
Totally. Absolutely. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. So what are some of your gut health hacks? We know all the importance of gut health now. What can we do to have healthier guts?
There's a lot that we could do. And before I address that, I want to mention one thing. We discussed about things that can disrupt gut health, and we said food, but it's really mindful to acknowledge that it's not only the food that we put in our gut that affects it, but our mental emotional state also affects our gut. Stress causes dysbiosis. So these are things that are important for us to be mindful of, that every time we're stressing, we're actually shifting that microbiome, we're affecting that immune system. So it's really important to be mindful of that, and just to keep in mind that it's not only the food that we eat and the alcohol that we drink, but also how we feel.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to addressing and optimizing the health of the gut, I think it's really important to keep that in mind, the mental emotional picture, which again ties into that systems biology approach, or that holistic approach to health, that everything is connected. The mind and the body are important to be in alignment in order to achieve optimal health. So as far as what are my go-tos, well, functional medicine likes to simplify things and provide rules, and not rules, but simplifications and approaches that kind of, ensure that we're addressing the higher priority things first. So in functional medicine, we do what's called the 5R approach. The first R is removing. So when it comes to gut health, I think the most important thing we can do is removing the things that are bad for the gut. So what are some things that are bad for the gut? Well, processed foods, sugar, alcohol, artificial flavors, colors, sweeteners, things like that, foods that are contaminated in pesticides and persistent organic pollutants and heavy metals. All of those things are going to contribute to a state of dysfunction in the gut. And if our goal is to optimize it, we need to remove those things. Another thing is dirty drinking water, which is often overlooked. A lot of people are not drinking clean water, and tap water, these basic filters are just not cutting it. And when you're drinking something, I think you need to pay very close attention to the things that you're consuming on a regular basis every day, especially multiple times a day, like
Mm-hmm.
drinking water. So if
Yeah.
you're having 8 to 10 cups of water, it better be clean. So drinking clean water, so removing, again, the dirty water that could be contaminated, removing those dirty foods, very important. And also, we got to make sure we're avoiding foods that are heavy in pesticides,
Yeah.
and because what those pesticides are doing, they're sprayed on those fruits and vegetables, those pesticides and herbicides, to kill off bugs. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we ingest them, we're killing off our own microbiome.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating. So we got to be very mindful of that. That's why always I educate people on the foods that are toxic
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that they're avoiding it. That's why I think the environmental work group is such an incredible organization, because it provides us with good data to be able to better educate our patients. And every year they come up, which I know you're aware of this,
Yeah.
the Dirty Dozen, Clean 15. The
Uh-huh.
Dirty Dozen are the 12 fruits and vegetables that are heavily contaminated in pesticides and herbicides and should only be consumed in organic form. So
Mm-hmm.
these resources allow us to better educate our patients, and the Dirty Dozen Clean 15 is actually a very good resource that allows us to lower our toxic load and our consumption of fruits and vegetables that are high in these processed foods.
Yeah.
So removing these foods would be the first step. I'm going to let you comment on that first before we get on to the second step.
Yeah, well, I think you're right on there. Being mindful of what we put into our mouth is just the first step of kind of healing our gut. I also really love what you said about our mind, what is going on in our mind, and how that's also a big part of gut health. We know that physiologically, toxic thoughts can trigger immune responses. And can also release stress hormones. When you have elevated levels of stress hormones, you're not getting as much blood flow to the gut. That's impairing digestion. That's impairing nutrient
Absolutely.
absorption. Less nutrient absorption, you got problems everywhere. So we know that we can say toxic thoughts are bad for your gut, but this is a physiological process that's going on. So I think, the first step you mentioned for healthy gut is input from our minds, input through our mouths.
Absolutely, very right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I feel like we're living in such a fast-paced society now that's quite disruptive to the gut.
Yeah.
Like you said, when we're in a state of stress, or we call it fight or flight or
Yeah.
sympathetic activation, it's a survival thing. It's like if we were being chased by a tiger, we would go into fight or flight. And what our body does is it shunts the blood away from the digestive system into our muscles, into our heart, so we could run away from that tiger. It's a survival thing. So
Yeah.
if we're in that constant state, or if we're in a state of stress, in that fight or flight state, and which a lot of people are stuck in
Yeah.
because of the pace of society, when we eat food, we're not going to have the digestive capacities to be able to process the food, break it down, and properly utilize it. And that is actually a disastrous thing, because when we're in that state of fight or flight, also the motility of the gut is impaired. So the gut isn't going to be moving the food along. It's just going to sit there. It's going to putrefy, literally rot inside us, off gas a whole bunch of nasty toxins or whatnot. And it's just just setting the stage for disaster. So one thing that I spend a good amount of time educating my patients on is mindful eating, eating in a calm, relaxed state, chewing well. So when it comes to the first step of removing eating in a rush, or
Yeah.
removing the stress from the eating process, I think goes a long way into optimizing digestion and absorption of nutrients.
Yeah. So there are so many steps that you were kind of mentioning there in digestion, absorption, there's movement, and that's kind of some of the thought process between the 5 R's is addressing all of those so we can put all of them together and achieve optimal gut health. So what are some of the other steps?
So the second step is replace. So over time, as we stress, more stress we have with use of, some people use over like PPIs, proton pump inhibitors.
Yeah.
Um, and with age, what happens is that the stomach acid declines.
Mhm.
So back to basic physiology.
And with stress, you don't have to be old to have declining stomach acid.
There you go. And with stress, exactly. So with basic physiology, when we eat food, it goes down the esophagus. First place it goes is the stomach. In the stomach, we have something called stomach acid.
Yeah.
That plays an incredibly important role in the digestive process. It breaks down proteins. It activates other enzymes. It allows for the absorption of minerals like calcium, magnesium. And so if that stomach acid is disrupted or not there, it's going to compromise our digestion. So first thing we got to replace is the stomach acid. I don't mean by adding stomach acid in there, but I mean by doing things that optimize the body's innate ability to make its own stomach acid and, you know, allow it to do its thing. Once we've addressed the stomach acid, then we got to focus on making sure the enzymes are there and that bile acids and things like that are there in order for us to be able to break down the macronutrients, the proteins, fats, and carbs, and be able to digest them and absorb them. So replacing the stomach acid, replacing the enzymes play an incredibly important role. And one simple thing I tell everyone to do is avoid or limit drinking fluids with meals, because all you're doing is pretty much diluting that stomach acid.
Yeah.
And when you dilute that, it's just going to compromise the digestive process. It's not going to be as efficient as breaking things down. So, these simple steps can go a long way in replacing these underlying deficiencies that a lot of people are actually experiencing, because malabsorption, indigestion, malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, these are all very common things now.
Yeah, and this touches back on mindful eating. First stage of digestion is when you think about food, you interact with food, you see it, and that kind of mindfulness actually increases stomach acid production, and it kicks your enzyme production into gear. So that's just simple. You don't have to take anything. It's free medicine.
Exactly. And I really think like a lot of these things were in our roots, like ancestral roots dating back to thousands of years, sitting around a table as a family, even praying over food a little bit, all of these things had adaptive benefits for us that, optimized digestion and absorption. So when we think about it, we kind of were doing these things, but with society becoming so fast paced, we've kind of lost touch with it. So it's really important to go back to our roots and see what was working, that allowed the human species to develop to where it's become.
Yeah. So we've got remove, replace.
And now we got reinoculate.
Or repair.
Sorry. Then we got repair. We got repair and reinoculate. They're in the order doesn't really matter. So I'm not prioritizing over that, because I don't want a bunch of people messaging us being like, "Oh, this is more important." Well, I'm not ordering it in priority. So we'll
if you reinoculate, you're repairing. So
yeah, they go hand in hand. So with respect to repair, as we touched on earlier, with stress, with crappy dietary decisions, potentially underlying infections, parasites, whatnot, or autoimmune processes, what happens is that the cell barriers, those enterocytes, that one thin layer cell, like you mentioned, they develop gaps in between them. So they become leaky. And what happens is that these undigested food particles go through. So repairing this gut lining is incredibly important. And the first step of repairing it is removing the bad food, which we've already addressed in our first R. But the second step is eating foods that allow it to repair. So foods that are good fuel for those enterocytes, things like glutamine, things like collagen or bone broth, these nutrients.
Vegetables.
Or even vegetables. That's where I was going to the next one. That's the most important one, because the greatest nutrient for these enterocytes is butyrate, which is a form of short chain fatty acids. And where does short chain fatty acid comes from? Well, it comes from where fiber coming from these vegetables and fruits that we eat interacts with the bacteria in our gut. So when those things interact, they produce these short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is the primary fuel source for these enterocytes.
Yeah.
So this is why I was saying the reinoculate part is tied into this repair part, because we have to reinoculate, put the proper probiotics or the good bacteria back in there by eating lots of fruits and veggies. But at the same time, what it does is it allows this short chain fatty acid to be produced, which is which is a great fuel source for the lining of the gut.
Yeah, amazing. And then the fifth one, what's our fifth R?
The fifth R is rebalance. So what can you eat? Before we go there, I want to touch on a little bit more on the reinoculate, because we really didn't talk about how do we do that. And I think it's really important to address something, because we've seen a lot of hype. I know you can agree to this, that so much hype about probiotics, different probiotics, what strain of probiotics are good for me. But one thing is really important in that the probiotics, yeah, taking a probiotic supplement is good, but it's not the solution to reinoculating. We have to, probiotics are like tourists. So if you eat them, they're just going to pass through and just get eliminated, just like a tourist passing through a country. So the goal is to allow these probiotics just mean good bacteria. So the goal is to allow these probiotics to colonize and grow in our gut and just populate and, flourish. So it's really important to look at our gut like a garden. This is the analogy that I give. So we want to put in the probiotics in there, the good bacteria, sure. But also we want to be supporting these guys with fruits and vegetables so that they can colonize. So the fruits and vegetables, they contain fiber and prebiotics. And prebiotics are just the food for the probiotics or the bacteria. So we want to be feeding these bacteria or the probiotics with the fruits and vegetables, giving them a chance to really inoculate and grow and colonize in our gut. And the key to having good microbiome or bacterial balance is diversity. We don't want to have too much growth of one or two species. We want to have growth of a lot of species. So that's the key, diversity. And so how do we accomplish diversity? And that's where variety in the fruits and vegetables comes. We want to make sure we're eating a variety of fruits and vegetables, different colors, because each color not only represents a different phytonutrient, but it represents a different form of fiber or prebiotic and allows different groups of the bacteria to colonize. That's why a lot of times I tell my patients, not only look at your gut like a garden, but try to give it as much diversity and eat the rainbow. Make sure you're eating not only green leafy vegetables.
Not Skittles, the rainbow.
Not Skittles. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Whole foods.
Yeah.
So not only to make sure you're, because a lot of people are like, oh, I eat my salad, but but are you really getting like the purples, the yellows, the orange, So it's really important to eat a variety of colors. And oftentimes when I want to really prioritize the microbiome, I have a handout, functional medicine handout. I didn't make it, can't take credit for it. That every day it has like a rainbow and you have to check off if you ate yellow, if you ate purple, if you ate red. So this kind of makes you mindful. When you look back after a week, you're like, maybe I haven't been eating enough purples. Maybe I haven't been eating enough reds. So, it encourages you to go out of your comfort zone and maybe grab a vegetable or a fruit that you usually wouldn't, just so that it encourages diversity.
Well, I love that you say that, because it really shifts the focus from, gut health, and really this applies to any type of health, is not in a conventional capsule and it's not in a naturopathic medical capsule or an alternative capsule. It is lifestyle, and lifestyle is how you obtain that diversity. And I also love that you mentioned the kind of repopulating the gut. Because that's why all of the R's or all of these approaches, doing everything together is important, because having healthy amounts of gastric acid is going to help fight off bad bacteria. Having
Yes, thank you
healthy
for
gut
mentioning that.
lining is going to help protect from bad bacteria. So it's everything is working together.
Yeah. And so this is a beautiful segue for the last R, which
Yeah.
is rebalance, in that what do we have to do on this person at a body, mind, and spirit level to
Yeah.
allow them to sustain these changes long term? We want to, I don't like using the word diet ever because it implies a short term nutrition plan. Instead, I like to use nutrition plan because it's inevitable. It's long term. It's the basis for our long term. And so when we say rebalance, it's really important to be able to, work on the other factors besides the food so that this person can sustain this way of living long term. Let's rebalance their whole life so that they can sustain this long term. And so one of the first things we do is working on things like stress management, because one thing that you mentioned, which is interesting, that I think we haven't mentioned and is an incredibly important part of gut health and something that often goes unnoticed, is motility. And
Yes.
motility is just simply the passage of food through the digestive system. And a lot of times, like that nervous system that the gut has, when the nervous system of the gut is affected, it'll affect this motility.
Yeah.
And the motility, if it's too slow, it could be bad. If it's too fast, it could be bad. If it's too slow, what happens is the food will sit there and it'll pretty much rot. And if it's too fast, it'll just run through you, won't give you a chance to absorb the nutrients.
Yeah.
So, that's a problem. If there's no movement, if the motility is slow, we can have another problem, in that the bacteria could go from a place that it's not supposed to be, like the large intestine, it could come back up. So we got to make sure that things are moving along, not too fast, not too slow. And the best way to regulate the motility of the gut is through stress management, making sure, we're in a calm, relaxed state, and supporting the body with things like acupuncture are great, because it allows us to increase the resilience of our body to stress, because stress is inevitable. We can't come out here and say, oh, avoid stress. That is not a realistic thing.
Yeah.
What we could do is we can educate people and our patients on ways that they could support their body to increase their resilience to stress. So when life throws us a curveball, we bend and we don't break. So I really love to look at myself like a tree. I bend, but I don't break. And so that encourages me to take on these additional things in my life, like yoga, meditation, breath work, grounding, spending time with loved ones, in nature, with pets, because all these things are going to increase your resilience to stress and just allow you to bend a little, but not break.
So this is why I love the functional medicine perspective, because it just ties everything together. Petting my dog, healthy relationships, good for my gut health. Yeah. So, and I think, the way you described things today really kind of tied all of it together. We're wanting to make sure that we remove the things that are harming our gut. We're replacing the things that are good for our gut by our lifestyle, the way we think, the way we're interacting with the world, but also the things that we're eating. We're shifting what we eat to provide a diversity of food that's actual food, non-processed food. And then we're playing all of these things together in balance.
Right, exactly. It does bring it all together. And, it might be a lot for some people to take in at first, but anytime people get overwhelmed, I share one piece of advice with them that I feel is very powerful. So when it comes to making decisions as to, what is healthy and what is not healthy to put into your body, I just, because people come to me, they're like, oh, this is calories, this is too much calories, is this gluten-free? There are just so many trends and things going out there that even I'm confused. And I spent the last 15 years, just constantly in this space. So I can only understand what the average person feels like when they go on the internet and do some research. So anytime people get overwhelmed, I just say, just stop and ask yourself, was this food made by nature, God, or was it made by man?
Yeah.
made by nature, and if it came out of the ground, chances are it's good. Things that our grandparents ate years ago, those foods are completely fine. But if it was man-made, it's in a box, and it has a huge ingredient list, chances are it's no good.
Yeah.
And this is really, really important because I feel like the food industry and the marketing is not really helping, people sort and swift through this information, because a lot of people are now thinking, oh, gluten-free, as long as it's gluten-free, it's okay for me.
Yeah.
But it's not, because a lot of times these gluten-free foods are so processed and have so many ingredients that sure, they're gluten-free, but they have so many other so many other additives and items in there that are not very good.
Which is
So
why we do a nutrition plan and not a diet, because the diet is trying to work foods for a short-term goal. A nutrition plan is focusing on nutrition for overall health.
exactly. And how do we achieve that nutrition? Through real foods, things that don't have ingredient lists, single item foods that are just real, intended to be eaten the way that, nature made them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, clearly you're a wealth of information. We could probably talk about this for a lot longer, but I do want to ask you where people can go and learn more about what you're doing. You're not just a doctor, you have all kinds of incredible wellness, fitness things that you do, and you have lots more information like what we discussed today. So where can people kind of learn more about you?
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words, Chelsea, and I look up to you a lot. I should address you as Dr. Chelsea now, but we're classmates, and so it takes a little bit of transition, so please forgive me. I'm located in San Diego. I work at Pacific Pearl. I'm the resident naturopathic doctor at Pacific Pearl La Jolla right now. So if you're in that region and you're interested in working with me in person, that's an option. I recommend you check out pacificpearllajolla.com. Besides that, my Instagram is Dr. Pedi Natural Health. That's a good way to stay up to date with me. And my website is drpedinaturalhealth.com. There I have some good content on maybe some of these topics that we've talked about. But in addition, I have other ways that we could potentially work together if that's something that you're interested in.
All right. Well, you're one of the best health educators that I know, so I really encourage everyone to check those resources out. And you're a great doctor.
Dr. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thanks for chatting.
My pleasure. It's a good one. I enjoyed it.